Once a board clearly defines its governance role, it can understand and apply the policy governance model's 10 principles. These 10 principles all have to do with board authority. They fall into 3 groups. The first 3 principles deal with the nature of boards by clarifying the source of a board's authority. The next 4 principles deal with the nature of policy, which serves as the voice of board authority. The final 3 principles deal with the nature of delegation, which enables the board to exercise its authority through others. The board acts on behalf of its owners, from whom the board derives its authority and to whom the board must answer. The board therefore exists to stand in for owners. Because it is not part of the organization itself, the board is situated between the organization and its owners. The board speaks with a single clear voice. The board acts as one when it makes decisions, and those decisions are documented in policy. I will go into a little more detail for each of these principles. Recall this graphic, which shows the few, the board, as subordinate to the many, the owners. In the case of school boards, the many are the citizens of a school district who vote to select their owner representatives. So the school board receives its authority from its citizens. This graphic shows the second principle, with the board situated between the organization, the lower triangle, and the owners, upper triangle. The chain of command is shown pictorially, with the superintendent accountable to the board and the board accountable to the owners. The third principle clarifies to whom the superintendent is accountable, because authority resides only with the single voice of the board. During debate on an issue, members voice their independent opinions. At the moment the board takes a vote, the board, through majority opinion, speaks. After the meeting, the president speaks for the board when citing what the decision was. In following this principle, what members say might differ as individuals might differ from what the board has said as a board, but they support the outcome. These 4 policies describe the nature of policy. Policy speaks for the board between meetings. Ends policies are defined in terms of what outcomes should be achieved. They describe what good for which beneficiaries and at what cost or relative priority. Defining ends, sometimes called results or goals, is the primary duty of the board. The board also sets means policies that guide its own actions and with which the board will hold itself accountable. Policies that guide executive decisions about how to achieve desired ends are called executive limitations, sometimes parameters, and are defined negatively. In other words, the board only describes what would not be acceptable. By only setting limits on executive decisions, the board empowers executive decision-making. There could be multiple acceptable ways to achieve the outcome, but what matters most is that ends are achieved without violating specific owner decisions about how to get there. The policy size principle provides guidance to a policy governance board that reduces necessary size of board policy to only what is required to assure success. Each policy begins with the broadest possible statement, then only goes into detail to clearly state what is desired without going on and on. Following this principle, a policy governance board may exercise governance in as few as 30-plus pages of policy, rather than the more traditional management-oriented policy books of 300 or more pages. A simple illustration of principles 4 and 6 is offered by a football field. The coach tells the team, "There's the end zone. Go get to the end zone, but don't go out of bounds." This simple 2-part instruction offers leeway to players on the field. Such freedom within limitations is a powerful combination that encourages initiative without going all the way to the opposite of micromanagement, which is laissez-faire or abdication. The 4 sets of policy found in a policy governance policy manual include ends or results or goals policies, executive limitations or parameters policies, governance process or board structure and process policies, and board superintendent relations or roles policies. The 2 to the right are policies that guide the superintendent, while the 2 on the left guide the board president and the board itself. Here's how the 7th principle works. Carver refers to the different levels of policy language as if they were nested sets of bowls. Language at the broadest level, for example, the preamble of a policy statement, influences the whole set, so that if you change it, you change the whole policy. Only when that first level is insufficiently specific should the board proceed to the next level, say numbered paragraphs in the policy. When the board has gone far enough in detail that any reasonable interpretation would be acceptable, the board stops writing. You can see how changing the broadest level statement can actually move the entire policy. When reviewing policy, boards should ask itself if any of its more detailed guidance is actually necessary to assure performance. The final 3 principles have to do with the board's delegation of authority to management in order to carry out the work of the organization between board meetings. Since the board cannot be everywhere at all times, it must delegate. The question is whether such delegation is vague and implied. Most traditional boards leave a lot unstated, or such delegation is explicit. The 8th principle states that the board honors the idea of chain of command and only gives directions to the superintendent. Number 9 provides for interpretation of the board's words as written in policy. Any decisions that comply with policy are considered pre-approved as long as they come from a reasonable interpretation of what has been written. The idea is to empower the superintendent to make decisions that will not be second-guessed and don't need to wait for approval. Number 10 provides that all authority delegated to the superintendent comes with a catch. The superintendent has freedom to act, but must remember that performance will be monitored to assure reasonable progress is made toward owner-desired outcomes, while owner values are also being honored. Delegation is a function of leadership that is used with its one true employee, the superintendent. The board delegates sufficient authority to the superintendent to carry out assigned responsibility. Having delegated authority to act, the board follows up by holding the superintendent accountable for performance. Responsibility, authority, and accountability have to always be in balance. Principle 9 allows freedom of action to the superintendent when the board commits to accepting any reasonable interpretation of its policy language. The important thing is not the specific decisions made as to the means used toward desired ends. The key is whether desired results were achieved. Principle 10 might be called the proof is in the pudding because monitoring assures accountability. A policy governance board devotes a majority of its time in board meetings to the monitoring function.